All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Museum of Science Live. My name is Becca, my pronouns are she and her, and you're here for our coolest science stories daily headlines. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of different science stories from all over the world, and we're going to be taking any questions that you have about them on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom and you're joining us and would like to ask a question at any point, feel free to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us on Zoom and would like captions, you can click on the closed caption button and click show subtitles. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, thank you very much for being here today. Unfortunately, we will not be able to see any of your questions or comments at this time, but we do appreciate you being there. Now, with that, I have two other wonderful educators, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and share what story they're talking about.
Hi, thanks. I'm Meg, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'll be talking about a new website that gathers projects where kids can help scientists learn about childhood development.
My name is Chuck, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'll be talking about a colossal breakup of an ice shelf in the Arctic and what it may mean for the climate.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for being here today. I'm excited to get to your stories in just a little bit. For now, we're going to be starting with one of my stories, which is talking about Venus and volcanic activity. Then I'm going to be finishing up the rest of the program by talking about a swimming dinosaur. So I'm going to leave you intrigued at that. Now we're going to get started with looking at Venus and volcanic activity. Now, Venus is the second planet from the sun. It is similar in size to Earth, but it's very different from Earth. In fact, it's covered in thick atmosphere with many clouds, and the atmosphere is made up of gases that are not known to support life as we know it. And unfortunately, that also means that because of this thick atmosphere, we really weren't able to see much of the surface of Venus for a long time. Luckily, NASA and other areas have been able to develop some interesting tools in order to see the surface. Now, this is Magellan, and Magellan was an orbiter that went around Venus, in orbit around Venus, and it launched here from the Space Shuttle Atlantis in 1989. It was able to orbit Venus for 4 years, from 1990 to 1994. And in those 4 years, it took wonderful radar images and put them together so that we actually could discover a little bit more about the surface of Venus. We now know just over 70% of the surface because of these radar images. So it's been really cool to see what Venus actually looks like. And also, Magellan was able to find some really interesting features like these dome volcanoes over here on the left, and even lots of lava flows. And scientists actually found that approximately 80% or 85% of Venus is covered in lava flows. But the problem is on Venus, rocks don't erode as quickly as they do on Earth. So these could be millions of year old lava flows, or they could be more recent. Is Venus geologically active? Well, that's kind of been the question. But luckily, just recently, there was a paper that was published that lets us know a little bit more about it, because on Earth, we are geologically active. That's why we have really interesting features, plate tectonics, volcanoes. What's happening is there's some sort of movement underneath the crust in the mantle, the next layer in the Earth, which is causing for some of these magma, the heated rock, molten rock, to come up in a number of different ways. Sometimes it comes straight up from the mantle and creates volcanoes, oftentimes in the ocean, kind of like the Hawaiian volcanoes. Sometimes it comes up when two plates are spreading apart and can create volcanoes, like in the mid-Atlantic. And sometimes when one plate goes against the other one and goes underneath, something we call subduction, it can actually create a lot of fluid to form, melt some of the rock, and have volcanoes pop up, kind of like the Ring of Fire around many parts of the Pacific plate. So that's what happens on Earth, but is that happening on Venus? Well, as I mentioned, there was a study that was published just about a month ago in Nature Geoscience, and it tells us that perhaps it is. Scientists were looking at something called the corona or the coronae of these volcano structures, which were these ring-like structures around the outside. And they looked at a lot of them, and using the radar imaging and computer modeling, they were able to determine what an active or recently actively forming corona would look like, or one that was inactive, one that maybe is no longer an active volcano. And they determined that in order to be an active corona, you have to see the outer rise and the trench on the inside. That would be classified as something that is very recent or still forming. Whereas if you have an inactive one, all you would really see is the rim and kind of the inner high. That one isn't forming anymore. It's probably not an active volcano. So they looked at all the different corona that they could find on the different volcanoes, and they discovered that approximately 37 of the ones they looked at are active or recently active, which is a really, really big thing. And they're also grouped in specific areas. So maybe there's more activity on Venus in some areas than other. Now, we're going to have to send some more probes or some more orbiters in order to discover if these volcanoes truly are active. But this is a really good indicator that maybe Venus is currently geologically active and that we aren't the only planet in the solar system with geologic activity. With that, we're going to pass it on over to Meg, who's going to share a little bit about child development.
Thanks for that volcanic story there. Now we're going to move over to the world of childhood development, like Becca said, and I'm going to start by asking, have you ever wondered what babies are really thinking, or how quickly a toddler learns a new skill? Kids learn so fast, they're pretty amazing. And when they're born, they actually have all of their brain cells already, all 86 billion of them. But over the first few years of their lives, they are actually forming 1 million neural connections per second. And all of those connections are building up the framework that underpins their understanding of the world. Scientists who study how kids learn look at all sorts of aspects of their development as they progress through different milestones, like smiling back at you, or recognizing their own name, or waving bye-bye. Now, these researchers have several tricks up their sleeves for figuring out what's on a child's mind. But traditionally, these kinds of tricks involve meeting up in person with study participants. More and more, though, and especially just recently due to the novel coronavirus, labs are looking for online ways to connect with study participants. And at the same time, lots of families are finding themselves at home and spending more time together more than ever before. These unprecedented circumstances led researchers at MIT's Early Childhood Cognition Lab to make the most of this unique opportunity and push to help scientists meet parents and children where they are, online. Their new citizen science website, called Children Helping Science, debuted just recently, and it collects together dozens and dozens of studies from all over the world that are looking for kids to sign up and help them understand childhood development. Over the past several years, researchers have proven that study methods using online participation via internet browsers and webcams can reliably record things like where on the screen a child is looking, how long she looks at it, and her responses to prompts. These are really important tools because even if a baby is too young to tell you what she's thinking, what she pays attention to is a really big clue. So the fact that online tools can track this information, it means remote studies really have serious science potential. To take just one example, did you know that when you were a baby, you already understood physics? One MIT study called Your Baby the Physicist looks at how babies between 4 and 12 months of age understand the world around them. In multiple brief sessions, babies are shown pairs of videos through Look It, which is a platform for recording and analyzing a baby's response. For example, on the left, they're shown a video of a ball rolling down a ramp, while on the right, they're shown a video of the same ball, but this time it rolls up the ramp. Researchers can measure which video holds the baby's attention more, and it turns out that babies are fascinated by objects that seem to defy gravity or disobey other laws of physics. They know something is just not right about that. Even at just a few months old, babies have absorbed a lot of information about the world around them. Your Baby the Physicist is just one of many, many studies collected on the new Children Helping Science citizen science site. The different studies are grouped by age, ranging from newborns to teenagers, and there's even studies that are looking for parents to participate. By expanding studies like this online, the researchers are able to reach participants that might not be able to come into a physical lab to take part, like families that live far away, or families that don't have the time to make the trip, or at the moment, families that are quarantining. Researchers are really excited by this too, because they need lots and lots of participants of all kinds to gain clear results. And recruiting enough families is always a huge challenge of any study. Online recruitment through Children Helping Science will help them gather more data than ever before, and that allows them to see more detailed and more reliable results. So here's an example of one little physicist completing many study sessions, which allows the team to take multiple snapshots of her behavior, even seeing how it might change over time. In fact, Children Helping Science makes it so easy to get involved that researchers plan to pursue longitudinal studies, where they follow children over a long period of time to track their development. And if families participate in multiple studies that they find online, we may be able to start understanding the timing of when different skills develop and how that's related. One lead researcher described the platform as the Hubble telescope of child development because this never before seen depth of focus that it can provide by widening the lens or the net to gather lots and lots of participating families. So if you've got little ones interested in pitching in, check out childrenhelpingscience.com. And who knows, maybe we'll see more coolest science stories in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck, who is going to take us to the world of ice sheet breakup.
Thank you, Meg. I'm going to take you to the far northern Arctic. And to do that, I'll just share screen here for a second here, and then we'll talk about something you may have heard about on the major news services about the last intact ice shelf in the northern hemisphere breaking up. A slab of this ice shelf, which amounts to about 40% of its surface area, broke off. And the chunk that broke off was about 80 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that is larger than the island of Manhattan, which is about 60 square kilometers. So this is one of the largest ice shelf breakups in recorded history, and it is the last one that has been protected to some degree from this kind of breakups. So why is this kind of thing happening? Why are we hearing so more and more in recent years about these ice shelf breakups? Well, first of all, I want to show you where it is. It's up at the very top of Canada, at the top of what's called Ellesmere Island, which is about 83 degrees north latitude. So it's the closest point of Canada to the North Pole. And it's an area that's always been surrounded by sea ice. Now, all of a sudden, we've got these ice shelves breaking up. Why is this happening? Well, what is it that makes sea ice vulnerable? First of all, it is increased air temperature. Of course, if you've got higher air temperatures and more days above freezing in the Arctic, and by a higher amount above freezing, you have more and more ice melting that can occur. Ice is also under attack. It's also vulnerable from below when you have the higher water temperature. And sea ice temperatures all over the world, but especially in the Arctic, have been increasing by 2, 3, 4 degrees Celsius in places in the Arctic. So you've got this ice that's sitting there under higher and higher temperatures. There are still things that protect it. There can be near shore ice in the form of ice floes or an ice pack that holds in the ice shelf and protects it from flowing out into the sea and more ice from breaking off. Wind and water currents can move that ice away, and that, in fact, is what happened in this particular case. There was a large area of open water that developed in front of the ice shelf, and that just made it vulnerable for seawater to seep in and for the melting to do its work. Now, this is a self-accelerating process. It's a bit of a vicious cycle because ice-free water and land are darker, and darker surfaces absorb more sunlight, and surfaces that absorb more sunlight get warmer and warmer. So as we get more and more melting, we get less and less ice to make things bright and bounce back the sunlight. So it's darker surfaces, and you get more higher temperatures. So far this year, we have had the Arctic warming at twice the global rate. That's been going on for the last 30 years. This year, the temperature in the Canadian Arctic has been 5 degrees above the 30-year average that we typically measure these things by. And that's a very wide amount. That's almost 9 degrees Fahrenheit. That's an incredible amount of warming that's occurred. Arctic sea ice hit a 40-year low in terms of surface area in late July, just a week or two ago. And you may have heard about the wildfires in Russia, record heat where the temperature is at least 10 degrees, that is 18 degrees Fahrenheit above normal along the Arctic coast and in Siberian Russia. So more about this particular ice shelf. It was the second largest ice shelf in the Arctic Ocean. In fact, after it broke off, pieces of it, as you can see in the photograph, broke off into other pieces, and those broke off into smaller and smaller pieces. They will eventually melt. The smaller they get, the more vulnerable they are to melting, the more likely they are to melt. A smaller ice cube will melt faster, even in a glass of ice water, than a larger ice cube. So this was about 40% of the surface area of that ice shelf, just broke off and disappeared. It was the last one that was protected by the pack ice and by near shore ice from breaking apart. So now all of the ice shelves are vulnerable to continue breakup, and we expect more breakup of this particular one in the days and weeks ahead. So what's the significance of this? Well, ice shelf breakups don't themselves raise the sea level up. However, they sort of open the door for more ice to flow from the glacier that is right behind the ice shelf to flow into the water. Right now, if you have an intact ice shelf floating on the surface of the water, that ice is helping to hold in that glacier. Break up, remove that ice shelf, and the glacier can start flowing faster. There's nothing to hold it back from flowing downhill into the ocean. And of course, all these extra pieces of ice in the ocean are a hazard to shipping, especially in the far north, where countries are beginning to investigate using the Northwest Passage again for shipping as a shipping lane. So that's a hazard as well. And because of more of these glaciers being free and ice caps being free to shed ice into the ocean, have it flow into the ocean, there is a sea level rise possible. So about that sea level rise, there's often a lot of confusion. Will this particular ice shelf breakup raise my sea level in my beachfront property or in my beach or wherever I happen to be at the shore? But ice that's already in the ocean, you know, from having a glass of water, all that ice can melt if it's in the glass of water. It won't raise the water level at all. So ice already in the ocean is not a problem. But ice that is in the ocean that is removed is no longer a blocking factor for ice flowing in from the land, as we mentioned. So that ice on the land, the glaciers, the ice shelves can flow more readily into the land. That's already happening in the Greenland ice cap and raise the sea level. So that is our story about ice caps. And there, of course, I anticipate will be more and more of these events happening in the Arctic. So now I'd like to hand it back over to Becca.
All right, thank you, Chuck. That was really interesting to see. Now I'm going to be finishing us off with the last story, but as a just general reminder, if you have any questions about any of our first three stories or this last one, you can put them into the Q&A box if you're joining us on Zoom. Now remember, the first stories were volcanic Venus, story into childhood development study, and also the Milne ice shelf. But that brings me to our last story of the day. And the last story is one of my very favorites, one that I've done a few times here because I love it. This is all about a swimming dinosaur. And that swimming dinosaur is Spinosaurus, or more specifically, Spinosaurus aegypticus, which was a dinosaur that was discovered a very long time ago in the 1910s, the early 1900s. And it was discovered by these bones here. Now, these bones, the actual fossils themselves, were lost during a war, but we do have these images of them. They're enough to let scientists know that this was something a little bit different, but they didn't know too much more about it. In 2014, we learned a lot more because scientists were able to find a whole nother set of fossils, which was able to discover that it looked probably a little bit more like this, maybe a little bit less upright, a little bit more kind of moving over, and potentially it swam. But they didn't really know for sure. That is until this year, when scientists published a new study. They were able to find more fossils in the Kem beds of Morocco, which are along what used to be a giant river. It was called the River of Giants, specifically because it housed a lot of really large dinosaurs on the shores. So maybe it makes sense that this one would take to the seas to get more resources. So scientists discovered approximately 80% of a tail in the Chemchem beds of Morocco. And approximately 80% is almost an entire Spinosaurus tail, which is amazing because not only does it let them know a little bit more about how it moved, but we also know a little bit more about how it looked. This is a better representation of what we think the Spinosaurus actually looked like now, whereas before it was a little bit more upright with a sail on its back, kind of like a T-Rex. Now, they also were able to test out that tail. They made a model of it and they applied it to an apparatus so that water could flow through it. And they could test something called the thrust, essentially how well this tail could make its way through the water. They compared it to two completely aquatic animals of today and two completely land dinosaurs that would not have swam at all. And they tried to figure out how well this tail would do compared to those. Well, it turns out it did about 8 times better than the two completely land animals at getting through the water. But it also turns out it did about 2 times worse than the completely aquatic animals, letting us know that, hey, maybe this is a semi-aquatic dinosaur. Well, that just means it probably spent most of its time on land, but also probably did a good amount of swimming in that river in order to find food. So we have a much better understanding of what the Spinosaurus probably actually looked like with these most recent discoveries. And don't let these 3D models fool you. It was huge. In fact, it was larger than a T-Rex, even though these look much smaller than that. So Spinosaurus was a major predator during its time, and we have a lot more to learn. We don't really know what that sail is on its back. Maybe it was for swimming, like a sail of a boat. Maybe it was to keep it cool or warm and regulate its temperature. Again, we're going to have to keep exploring and keep figuring out what my favorite dinosaur was all about. Now, those have been our 4 stories, our daily headlines. So I'm going to invite Chuck and Meg to come back on, and we're going to start answering some of your questions. So if you have any questions on Zoom, feel free to type them in. So I have a few questions for Chuck. So Faith, age 9, is asking 2 separate questions, but I think I'm going to group them together. What is the biggest ice shelf ever lost, and can ice shelf depart in the winter?
So the largest ice shelf that's ever lost, and that's a great question too. This one that broke up July 30th and 31st was not the largest. The largest happened in March 2002 in Antarctica, the Larsen B ice shelf. In a space of about a month, over 3,000 square kilometers. That's over 1,000 square miles, which is an area about the size of eastern Massachusetts. Broke off and shattered into small icebergs. Once again, that was in March of 2002. So the last part of the question is, in winter, do ice shelves? Well, ice shelves are basically extensions of glaciers that kind of stick out into the ocean, and because ice is lighter than water, kind of floats out over the ocean. If anything, in winter, that ice shelf consolidates and gets more because ice freezes around it, and it freezes in any of the cracks that happen to have developed in it. That will help to stabilize the ice sheet during the winter. Ice sheet breakups happen during the summer when you get all of these factors: warm water, warm air, you get cracks developing. Seawater can permeate the cracks and actually help to mechanically weaken the ice shelf from inside and from below. And so that's why they happen mainly during the summer. But ice shelves, any breakup that happens tends to be frozen in place during the winter.
All right. I also have a question for Meg. I'm going to ask you one for myself. I was wondering, I know you said that there are specific milestones that the babies may reach at certain times. Are scientists expecting to see a general trend, or do they think it might be very different depending on each individual?
Oh, that's a great question. There is sort of a standard series of milestones that scientists and doctors look for. And if you have a little one and you're going to the pediatrician regularly, they will ask you, has he done this yet? Has she done that yet? And that's because there is a general progression of skills where the brain, since conception, needs to develop a certain amount in order to achieve certain tasks, and then other tasks depend on each other. So you sort of they build up a repertoire. But that being said, there is a large range in the timing of these different developments for individual children. So there's kind of a distribution, which means sort of a range where you could have maybe the average child will do something at 4 months, but certain children might get there at 3 months, or they might get there at 6 months. And that doesn't mean that anything's wrong. It just means that that's their timeline. So it's a little bit of both, but they are important markers, because if you get something that is very far toward one of the tails of the distribution, then it might be something that you would want to keep an eye on. And that would be an early clue as to whether you need to look into that further and keep track. So great question. And I have another one for you, Becca, where we have Wona, age 8, wants to know how many volcanoes are on Venus?
Oh, that's a great question. And scientists have found quite a few, but of those many volcanoes that they think they found, some of them may not even be volcanoes. That has to be a volcano if there's some sort of active magma source. However, it could be an extinct volcano that is now a mountain. They do know for sure, based on this study, again, it's not for sure, but they theorize based on this study that 37 of them might be active. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't more. It doesn't mean that there's fewer than that, but that's still a good amount of potentially active volcanoes. We have more on Earth now. Doesn't mean we won't find more on Venus. Just means that we don't know for sure and just need to keep studying.
And I will say that Venus has more volcanoes on it than any other planet in the solar system. At least 1,000 confirmed volcanic structures. There may be as many as 1,600, but most of them are probably long extinct. But that's remarkable. Has been a remarkably volcanic planet.
Absolutely. All right. And it looks like we have time for maybe just 1 or 2 more questions. So this one is for Chuck. Mahiro, age 11, is asking, will a part of land or a city sink underwater because of the glacier melting from behind the ice shelf?
Well, as that water pours into the ocean, it is like adding more glass to the ice, more ice to the glass. And so it will eventually raise the level of the water. It's estimated that if the Greenland ice cap were to completely melt, and it may take 1,000 years for it to do this, but as warming continues to spiral more and more out of control, that time may be less. That worldwide, the water level would rise by about 18 feet. That would be enough to flood every major coastal city in the world to some degree, whether it's just the docks or the area right near the coast. In Boston, that might include streets 2 or 3 streets back from the coastline. So this has global implications, not just local implications. So if it keeps happening, we've already started to notice the sea level rising by about 6 to 8 inches since the beginning of the 20th century. Now that's over a century, but the process does seem to be accelerating. So that's something to watch for, definitely.
Awesome. Thank you. And unfortunately, it looks like we are out of time. I know there's quite a few questions that just came in towards the end here that I wish we had time to answer. Thank you so much for sending them in. But we are out of time. So I'm going to ask my fellow educators to say your goodbyes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Listening.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for being here today. And thank you to our audience for being such a great audience and asking such amazing questions. If you would like to see more of these programs, head on over to www.mos.org/MOS at home to see a complete list of our virtual offerings. And if you enjoyed this program and would like to support MOS at home or the museum in general, you can head to engage.mos.org/welcome. Once again, I want to thank you all very much for being here, and we'll see you next time.